Still Wakes the Deep is a horror game developed by the Chinese Room, developers of games like Amnesia, Machine for Pigs, and our story takes place on an oil rig featuring a group of oppressed, blue-collar Scottish workers spouting language so colorful that the YouTube demonetization hit squad has at least 3 snipers trained on my current position. You play as Kaz, an aggressive alcoholic who has nearly ruined his marriage and is on the run from the police after putting a man in the hospital, which sounds less like the opening to a horror game and more like the plot to an amazing country song before Florida Georgia Line invented bro country. On the topic of hot takes, you've probably noticed the title of the video is one of those, and I am not a man who exaggerates for the sake of clickbait. I am standing by my claim that the monsters in Still Wakes the Deep are an active detriment to the game as a whole, because when I make a controversial claim, I mean it, such as saying Bendy's art style is boring, calling Secret of the Mimic the scariest FNAF game, and a single joke about the combat in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 being slow, which apparently is the most egregious of these offenses.
Another angry Xenoblade 2 comment.
Defeated. My power grows.
But to stop making fun of Xenoblade 2 for a moment, my opinion of Still Wakes would be scarier without the monsters came about when I was staring at the end credits and wondering why I was being left so unsatisfied. Everything about this game, from the well-written characters, the disgusting monster designs, the loud and chunky architecture, and the overall oppressive vibe of the oil rig should have had me falling in love with this game just like the 2 adult women in Xenoblade 2 fell in love with a canonically 15-year-old boy. The difference is my love for horror is only slightly less creepy. But after looking over the game again, I came to the conclusion that out of everything I like in Still Wakes the Deep, almost every problem I have with the game, from my issues with its story, gameplay, and ending, all stem from those gribbly little tumor babies and how the game implements them. And I have not only my opinion, but an entirely unnecessary amount of scientific sources to back me up. But before I begin, there's a couple elephants in the room that I need to put down. First, I previously stated that I'd be reviewing Charleston Choo Choo next, but after 6 videos in a row, I'm a little burnt out from mascot horror and all its sexy monsters. So Thomas and the Cannibalistic Railroad will be the next Let's Dissect instead. Second, in my Secretary of Manhattan review, there's a major part of the game I missed out on, something so egregious that the top comment on that video is pointing it out. So let me take this moment to rectify that issue. There, my review is now perfect and has no flaws at all. And with those 2 elephants slaughtered, how about I stop with all the teasing and get on to why you clicked on this video in the first place? To watch a guy talk about how an eldritch horror game would be better without the eldritch horror. Before we can start talking about the Meatmen, we need to establish this game's background and story. If you already know the story, you can skip to this part of the video where I actually start using that unnecessary amount of scientific sources to talk about monsters in a video game. Though that does mean you'll miss what is a rather rare occurrence on this channel, unabashed and constant praise for extremely solid story and game design. While the title of this video may suggest otherwise, I really do like this game. There are so many elements of Still Shaun's the Sheep that aren't just done well, they're done fantastically. Even after the monsters show up and the game takes a bit of a dive, there are still some incredibly powerful moments, stellar voice acting, beautiful architecture. I like this game. So in this first part of the video, I am going to be, as the kids say, crispy creaming Still Wakes the Deep. We start off with a letter from our wife while we look at foggy scenery. And while the Silent Hill 2 comparison is obvious, I also want to bring up that this is the 3rd horror game I've played where we play as some kind of technical engineer who gets stranded on some kind of remote base while gribbly tentacle men try to rearrange our insides to be on our outsides. Joking aside, this is a good intro, as it immediately gives us some personal stakes for the character, as well as gives me something to do as the game drops 2 F-bombs in the first literal minute of gameplay.
Fantastic. Very festive.
This is a game starring Scotsmen, you say? Well, I'm not typically one to harp on about graphical fidelity. I do want to say that this game looks gorgeous. The subtle lighting against the muted colors really sells the whole gloomy mood the game is going for. Even the film grade effect, which I'm usually not a fan of, works very well with the vibe of this very 1970s horror film inspired game. In fact, the game itself takes place in the 1970s, which I suppose explains why the vibe is immediately so oppressive since we are still living under Margaret Thatcher. So you know you done f***ed up as a UK politician if even an American knows your name. This intro teaches us 2 very important things. Basic gameplay elements and that the subtitles are necessary because I might speak English, but I sure as hell don't speak Scottish.
Do me a quick fix.
works on the crew lift fuse box while you're down there.
Aye, no bother.
That's cool, you numpty.
I can scalp in this here all by myself.
We meet the colorful crew of the Byra D, ranging from a communist union rep, a Scottish Jamaican diver, and a member of the National Front who, appropriately, looks and sounds like an inbred ogre. If you don't know who the National Front are, just know that they would criticize the Imperium from Warhammer 40k for being too liberal. For those who don't know, the giant wearing a skull on his face is called a chaplain, and exists to make sure his fellow battle brothers stay sane and rational. While brief, this intro gives us a lot of well-written character. We really get the feeling that this is a close-knit group of overworked, understaffed individuals just barely scraping by, both in terms of money and literal exhaustion, which should all feel extremely familiar to anyone who's worked retail in white suburban America. Now, it may come as a surprise to you, but I've played at least one horror game, so I knew that this wasn't so much building characters as it was adding pathos to the inevitable corpse party we're about to endure.
Crafts here's a bit shaky though. Gonna be the lad's first solo dive this morning.
Now it's just pathos.
While a bit heavy-handed by front-loading it all like this, I still vastly prefer giving some actual character to the soon-to-be bodies we find dead in the hallway, instead of stumbling upon just a bunch of random corpses we have no connection to. God, that sounds callous. I love talking about horror. Out on deck, we get treated to one of my favorite environments in gaming: heavy industrial equipment. Is it really a surprise I play orcs? Much like in Seconds to Mars, the game has us perform various kinds of mouse movements or other interactions in order to manipulate mechanical components or even just climbing ladders. And while I can see many people finding this mechanic annoying, I consider it a necessary part of the horror to come. Seriously, this manual control scheme actively makes the game scarier, but that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves, and we still have an even scarier force to reckon with: middle management. Earlier, our breakfast was interrupted by a call from a screeching bag of wind named Rennick, and almost all the workers we pass on the way to his office talk about him as if he had personally gone to each of their houses and shot their dogs in the face. Honestly, this walking caricature of an out-of-touch boomer had better build-up than most of the monsters I've encountered on this channel, and after this little values realignment talk, I definitely wanted him to end up like half of those monsters did. He's angry with us, one, because he gives off the vibe of a man overcompensating for several shortcomings, but two, because he's found out that we're on the run from the police. Fuck. I'm getting infected by the Scottish. He's found out that we're on the run from the police, and he's worried the attention will bring eyes on him in the pristine condition of his oil rig. Something to note here is a phone call that Rennick gets during our "go ahead and call HR, all they'll do is send me to mandatory training" talk, where he does what middle management does best: fail to understand the problem and deflect blame when he demands you do something you absolutely know is going to fuck things up for everyone. Of course, this is a horror game, so his little outburst of proactive leadership is less likely to result in financial loss as it is loss of life. But Kaz gets canned and thus becomes the third game on this channel to feature an overworked handyman protagonist who is being threatened with losing his job, which is apparently the secret formula required to making a horror game I actually end up liking. Again, stressing that fact, I like this game. I'm like subliminally messaging, I like and subscribe this game. We're forced to have the walk of shame to the helipad while the reality of being fired starts to set in. And even without Kaz saying anything, it really does start to weigh on the mind of the player. The whole point of Kaz coming to this rig was to avoid the police, not to mention he has the uncertainty of his wife and daughters back home as well. Of course, this is a horror game, so our sulking about is interrupted by Rennick's little oopsie daisy. I actually really love this moment because it has layers. For one, while we as the player know that this signals the start of the horror, this quake is mundane enough to keep the characters in the dark as to the true nature of the disaster. It also immediately assigns blame to Rennick for this mess, since we literally just saw him tell the drill crew to keep going despite them knowing better than him. Finally, this is where the Byra D claims its first victim, and it is easily one of the most memorable. He wasn't fodder for some monster. In the context of the situation, he was the victim of a tragic accident, and the way he's yelling out for us to help him, Kaz's panicked reaction and screams of "I wanna die! I wanna die!" really sell this moment, and it got a genuine reaction out of me when I saw him fall. Unfortunately, Kaz was a smartass as a kid, and when his mother asked him, "If all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you jump too?" he answered back, "Yes." Thankfully, Kaz has been gifted with the power of being a main character, so instead of dying, he has a flashback to life on land. There are a number of these sprinkled throughout the game, but for reasons I'll talk about later, I'm just going to sum them up all now. Through these flashbacks, we get an honestly tragic backstory of a man trapped in a spiral of anger. He's frustrated with his lot in life, but this causes him to lash out and further worsen his own situation. He alienates his friends, gets fired from jobs, which only further isolates and angers him. His wife, though she loves him, is genuinely worried for their children and is becoming exhausted with his anger and constant excuses. Even better, all of this is perfectly reflected by the setting of the game. Having Kaz go to work on an oil rig is a fantastic parallel to how his overall state of mind is. Much like the Byra D is falling apart, so does Kaz's life feel the same. And the isolation of the rig also perfectly mirrors his own feelings of isolation. And yet the crew, his his family is still there to support him, though he's at risk of losing them too, again, due to his anger issues. This is what I want from horror, what I crave. More than any kind of hunting section, more than a well-designed environment, more than an army of glam rock chicas chasing me down. What I want from horror is a way to tie the character into the horror and the horror into the character. Silent Hill isn't just some random guy running around a town filled with zombies. It's a guy running around a town that is actively using symbolism and metaphor to torture and punish him for his past. Soma isn't just the horror game I bring up in every one of my videos. It's about a character who was slated to die of a brain hemorrhage, suddenly being tossed into a world with monsters also suffering from horrendous mental distortions while he is constantly facing down his own demise again and again. Kaz feels like an honest character. I want to see where his story goes, where his relationship goes. I empathize with him. But waking up, we immediately see that Rafts, the man who was to do his first solo dive under the rig today, is trapped in the saturation diving bell and is currently going Donkey Kong Bonanza inside, which is understandable if you know even the first thing about saturation diving. If you don't, here's a quick synopsis. No f***ing thanks. But more importantly, this introduces us to the main mechanic of the game, fixing things that other people tell us to. More on that later, because right now our course of action is to get back to the top of the rig and try to figure out what's going on. So logically, our path there takes us underneath the rig first. The game pretends to be Mirror's Edge for a moment and we get our first glimpse at the shape. Its overall look, what with its gribbly architecture, has this weird, obscene beauty to it. We also get introduced to mechanics that aren't so much about platforming as they are desperately try to scramble across this crumbling architecture mechanics. I, again, love this kind of gameplay as it makes the environment itself feel hostile. So many times in desperate situations I forgot to hold onto a ladder the right way. I scrambled to make the right input as the Byra D was shaking. It really sold the idea that the rig is falling apart fast. Furthering this hostile work environment is when we get a message from the Bastard.
Jesus Christ.
This call immediately made me wish I was Scottish, so I'd have an excuse to call Rennick a word you can't say in America. So instead, I'm going to start talking about this sound design. It's also excellent. I may have never worked on an oil rig, offshore or otherwise, but my general fetish for heavy industrial equipment tells me that it is loud. Speaking of, we begin to hear noises that definitely aren't the oil rig. To confirm our suspicions, we run into Finlay, who informs us that, yes, there be monsters. And our first encounter with said monster is kind of a tease. People familiar with this channel will know about my distaste for linear chase sequences, so let me briefly sum it up here. I think they're fine when they either introduce or finish off a monster, but if it's the only way we get to interact with the monster, then I think that's just lazy and boring. Hunting sequences, by contrast, are when you're in a room with a monster and it's up to you and your wit to find a way to survive. This is why, when I saw the map on the wall, I started making noises far too giddy and excited for someone about to have their head torn off. Oh yes, I know what's gonna happen. What this looked like to me was a non-linear corridor where I'd have to evade and outwit the monster by finding my own path. Unfortunately, this map might as well have been an angel's favorite instrument thrown in the trash because it is a dirty liar. In truth, this section is pretty much a linear series of AAA game wall squeezing, with every path except for one blocked off. I never even saw the monster or felt hunted or even felt like it was getting kinda close to me. So it's not a linear chase and it's not a hunting section, rather it's some unholy Sonichu crossbreed that just left me kind of confused in the end. Fortunately, the experience was carried by the incredible sound design and overall concept of the monster. We can hear Gibbo's distorted voice pleading for help even as he, supposedly, tries to hunt us down. And I found myself wondering just how aware Gibbo was, or if he was just being puppeted, or what the hell else could be happening. I love when horror games toy with the concept of consciousness, continuity, what it means to be human, and Still Bakes the Neeps was gearing up to play with just that. Moving on, we get what is probably a really cool reference to The Thing, and we meet back up with Roy. Both of us then decide that Rennick is a dick and we need to skedaddle. Unfortunately, it seems the writing team had the same idea because the plot doesn't so much slow down here as it does fall over and die. For those of you who were waiting for me to get back to the point of this video, here you go, because I don't really have a way to describe the rest of the game that wouldn't just sound like, "Oi Kaz, you need to get to this place and do a thing, but there's a horrible monster in the way." And then you meet up with another person who says, "Oi Kaz, you need to get to this place and do a thing, but there's a horrible monster in the way." And I know that this is how a lot of, if not most, video games progress the story. I mean, for fuck's sake, I'm trying to 100% Death Stranding too. But games that do this still advance the plot in various ways. We get character developments, we learn more about the threat or antagonists, we learn more about the world itself, the threat escalates, and we're eventually given some big final goal and start working towards that. But this game doesn't do any of that, and in fact, we don't get a big final goal until the last 5 minutes of the game, and that's not hyperbole. Or I guess technically it is hyperbole, since we are literally given the "we have to do this final thing to kill the monster" goal about 2 minutes and 57 seconds before the game ends. At the very least, we do get some good character moments, and some really good emotional character deaths. Legitimately extremely well done. Just listening to them again in editing made me tear up, like, god damn. But since those characters have so little screen time compared to the overall runtime of the game, and also since their deaths were admittedly extremely obvious, like, come on, they had more death flags than Rexplode being happy at the end of Season 3. They were great moments of pathos, but they didn't really do much for the plot, except maybe for the very last death we see. But again, that happens about 7 minutes and 14 seconds before the end, so I guess it's about there the writers woke up from their nap and started writing again. But all those prior themes about Kaz's home life, anger issues, alcoholism, and alienation from his friends and family are dropped entirely. Barely mentioned again outside of the flashbacks we get here and there, and those flashbacks aren't revealing anything new to the plot. They're just building on Kaz's background, which is great, sure, but fleshing out character background doesn't move the story forward. It just gives it a more solid base, which this game absolutely has. But what Kaz never really gets is much character development, or hell, even character regression, which can be another way to move a plot forward. Really, the only plot developments we get are both the lifeboats and the escape chopper getting wrecked. But that only marks about the middle of the game, so after that, it's just Kaz running around trying to fix like 17 different things on this rig before the game just decides, yeah, that's enough, and ends. And even then, that's a punch in the balls too. We spend the second half of the game running around facing off all kinds of horrible monsters in an attempt to keep the rig afloat, and then in the last 2 minutes and 57 seconds, Kaz decides, okay, never mind, let's just blow it all up. And I am fine with the idea of a main character sacrificing themselves to kill the threat. And hell, I even agree with Kaz's decision, but you have to build up to that, or at least more build up than 2 minutes and 57 seconds. So after all of my prior incessant praise for the game that you all just sat through, after how incredibly strong the game started out, you can understand why I felt so confused when I was sat there watching the credits roll by and wondering why I didn't like this game nearly as much as I did at the start. And after a lot of thinking, which is to say, a lot of sitting at my desk staring slightly down at the floor in complete silence, it all revolved around how the game implemented its monsters, and finally we've come to the meat. Talking about how poorly Still Shakes and Bakes handles its man-meat gets surprisingly complex, so we're going to break it down into 3 categories: the monster gameplay, the monster design, and the monster's effect on the story. So let's go ahead with what I already kind of hinted at in the first monster encounter, how Don't Wakes the Daddy handles its monster gameplay. Talking about the monster gameplay of Be Still My Heart, it's actually pretty simple because it only comes in 2 flavors: linear chases and linear sneaking? Yes, pretty much every encounter with the monsters is linear in some way, even when it's not a linear chase, and the best example of this is the encounter on the deck here, mostly because every other encounter is way too dark for YouTube, and I mean literally too dark, as in brightness. I swear YouTube has some weird encoding thing where blacks appear even darker after uploading, and I refuse to turn up the brightness in my horror games because I am a big boy. This monster is the distorted form of Muir, but since I'm going to be bringing him up a lot in this video, and because his name feels awkward on my tongue, I'm just going to be giving him a whole bunch of silly names. Testicular Torsion Tommy is patrolling the deck of the Byra D, and as I stated, our previous objective is, "Oi Kaz, you need to get to this thing, but there's a gribbly monster in the way." That's not even close, that's just a orc voice. Now, there are several things I like about this encounter. Senor Meatball is typically positioned high above us, and honestly, there needs to be more horror games that play with verticality, as it quite literally adds another dimension to the encounter. The sound design as well is fantastic. These strange kind of whale sounds intermixed with his cries for help, but the encounter itself has several problems which more or less apply to every stealth section in the game. While this place looks open for me to run and hide around, it's really an illusion. You can see from the footage that I really only have one path to follow, follow, and my survival counts only on timing or throwing an object to distract him, usually placed oh so conveniently in whatever hiding spot I slide into. Compare this to the suit room in Secret of the Mimic. My destination is on the other side of this room while Jerry Seinfeld stalks around and tries to kill me. The difference in these two encounters is that here, there are multiple paths for me to take to get to my destination. I have to decide where to go next, and thus it's on my head if Barry B. Benton takes my head. And why the f do I know that character's name off the top of my head? I've never even seen B-Movie. Plus, this encounter gives you options. There are hiding spots and noisemakers littered around the room, but you don't have to use them. Again, it's all up to you and how you try to avoid the monster. In other words, living and dying is dependent on my choices, and having to make choices in a stressful situation is a very natural way to lead to fear. That's exactly what hunting sections like this do. They put almost all the control in the player's hands and require them to find a way out of a dangerous situation. With the deck monster, however, the game presents us with only a single linear path, which demands we do almost exactly what the game wants us to, or else we die. Sure, there's some decision making here, such as when we move to the next destination, but it feels less like I'm being hunted and more like I'm playing that one level in Hat in Time I keep referencing just to have an excuse to play this level in Hat in Time. Seriously, I love this game so much. This weird linear stealth section also limits our flight or fight response. Technically, the flight or fight response is the flight, fight, or freeze response, with some sources adding in a fawn response. That one being trying to appease or reconcile with the threat, which obviously I won't be talking about because I can't think of any horror games that have a negotiate with the monster mechanic.
Please don't break my arm.
No.
While the flight, fight, freeze response, or response is usually associated with a time where being eaten by lions was a genuine concern and not just a niche fetish, it's translated to modern times into various more esoteric forms. The modern fight response is far less literal and is more so associated with confronting a source of stress. Even in games where you have no way to actually fight the monster, the choice to stop hiding and progress by putting yourself further into harm's way can be considered a fight response, whereas leaving a hiding spot to retreat to a previously known safe area is a flight response. As an example, look at my first encounter with the Mimic. I have several uncertain moments where I choose to flight back to a known safe area, in instances of fight where I choose to actively work against the Mimic by using noisemakers or moving farther into unknown territory. This is yet another reason why hunting encounters feel so dynamic. Flight responses naturally make us feel safer, which is why humans love just avoiding difficult or uncomfortable situations, whereas the fight response makes us feel more stressed as we're choosing to put ourselves in greater danger, but accomplishing that fight response feels immensely satisfying. These linear sneaking sections greatly mute those feelings. Because our path is completely on rails, we don't have much desire to use our flight response because that's just making negative progress. Retreating doesn't allow us to find a better way around, it just means we'll have to completely redo the danger between hiding spots. And since we are 100% safe in these hiding spots no matter what, the freeze response can't be suddenly shattered by the monster finding us. Finally, even our fight response is muted since, like I said earlier, a great source of stress and fear is by giving the player options. When you go with your fight response in a game like Soma, the fear is enhanced by giving you various paths to go down or various objectives to grab, which lets you doubt your own decision making. Here, there are no decisions outside of when should I move to the next hiding spot. So while these sections are better than a linear chase, they're not that much better. Once I realized that these stealth sections were entirely linear, I felt far less intimidated because I knew everything was just following a very specific script. The game has exactly one path for me to follow and that's it. Nothing comes down to my own wit or decision making, it's just do what we want you to when we want you to or else you die. And pretty much every stealth section follows this pattern. And unfortunately, this isn't my only issue with how the monsters are used mechanically. As Still Rakes the Leaves, that one felt lazy, uses a certain mechanic I've also talked about before, instant death. Yes, every single threat in this game just kills you immediately. And unlike Security Breach or Secret of the Mimic, Still Wakes doesn't even have the excuse of using death for their iconic jump scares. Though I do want to say My Friendly Neighborhood had both jump scares and a health bar, so I don't really take that as an excuse. I'm just saying the reason I'm so against instant death in horror games is multifaceted. But again, it's something I've talked about before, so I'll just try to get through it quickly. For one, giving the player a health bar can be an added source of fear. We naturally feel most confident when we have full or high health, but as our health dwindles, suddenly every decision makes us just a little more hesitant. Being on low health also makes us desperate to find more health. We scrounge more, explore more, or maybe we don't out of fear that there's a monster around that optional route. Either way, it gives the player more decisions to make, which leads to more uncertainty and thus fear. A health bar also cuts down on repetition. Because you just die in one hit, making a single mistake will send you back and you have to repeat the situation you were just in. Like this part here where I have no idea what the hell I was doing wrong. Like literally, can any of you tell me why the monster killed me this time but not this time? Like what the hell was going on? Am I just crazy? Or repeated exposure to a stressor often leads to a process called habituation, which is where we stop being so afraid of something that once scared us. Thus, if the only way a game has to punish us for failure is death, we're going to be repeating gameplay more often and thus will become habituated to these specific circumstances more quickly. So because every encounter in this game is both linear and only has instant death, the horror feels very stiff, which is ironic considering how deliciously fleshy all these monsters are. And speaking of those gribbly little meat men, let's move on to their design in general and why my relationship with those designs could be aptly described as high school tsundere syndrome.
This is gay.
To again start with the positives, I mean, just look at these guys. They're disgusting, deformed, screaming monstrosities, and I love each and every one of them. As much as I loved the design of the Mimics costumes, choosing between that and well-done body horror, well, to quote Jaden Animations, I'm kind of an edgy bitch. But design only does so much. Even if a character has a fun or interesting look to them, if they're not used properly or are used in stupid ways, they're just gonna be kind of wasted. Like seriously, I can make an entire video talking about how bad of a character Mephiles is. He's an idiot and his plan only worked because everyone else around him is an even bigger idiot.
Let me get a good smell of you, little boy.
At risk of being sued by Nintendo, how about we play a game of Who's That Horrormon? I'd be willing to bet that most of you out there will be able to identify who these characters are. Even if you don't know them by name, you probably recognize their designs. This is because of 1, good marketing, and 2, it's how humans identify objects. While we don't have a completely solid answer just yet, it is currently believed that humans identify objects primarily via their shape and the imagined skeleton we assign to them. Of course, we have other methods of identifying objects such as color, texture, and motion, but shape and silhouette are among the most immediate and most efficient. Think back to the last time you went to a clothing store. It's not uncommon for the brain to give you a sort of jolt when a mannequin enters the side of your vision. Now take a look at the monsters from Stilt's Ache My Feet. These silhouettes are rather abstract. It's tough to get a real bead on which way they're facing or if you're actually looking at the monster at all, and you have to factor in that this silhouette that I'm showing you now is in a perfect vision scenario. In-game, it's usually too dark or too foggy to really get a good look at these things. Now on paper, that sounds great. After all, not being able to identify what you're looking at makes it scarier because what you don't know is scarier than what you do know, right? Well, in truth, it doesn't quite work like that. And in fact, that's why Eldritch Horror is so difficult to pull off in a video game. The whole idea behind Eldritch beings is that they are something our primitive minds can't comprehend. Our instinct has no response to this, and thus we get sent into a blind, shivering panic. This is fantastic in books or movies, but a problem in games because you can't really simulate this to the player. It's not because our feeble human minds are incapable of conjuring such a creature, but because that's not really how humans respond to unknown stimuli. Humans, and most animals in general, use a process called contextual discrimination. This isn't a word to describe racism against librarians, but rather, it's how we learn to respond to a specific stimuli. In the case of fear, it takes very little for our brains to learn to associate an object with danger. The most direct way is by witnessing that object act in a way that appears threatening. Another slightly more complex way is by our brain making assumptions given the environment. In other words, just the proper setting can make an object scary. Our brains can also immediately assign threat to an object by associating it with past similar threats. This is why so many horror tropes are a thing. They act as shortcuts to get our brain to associate the monster with danger. Loud and distorted screaming, huge claws or fangs, imposing size, distorted and gruesome features. These are all easy ways to have our brain say, yes, I should probably be afraid of that monster that is literally named Deathclaw. But can I fuck it? And this game does make use of situational context and horror shortcuts, so what's my problem then? First, remember that humans typically use an object's outline or silhouette to try to identify what it is. Next, remember that prior context is how we assign a threat to an object when we become aware of it. Now, these processes happen so fast in our giant, beautiful brains that they may as well be simultaneous, but the problem lies in that first step, identification. Because we encounter the monsters in either very hard to see situations or just have a very undefined outline, it takes us quite a bit longer to identify if we're looking at the threat or not. Because of this, that moment of fucking hell is replaced by, is that Okay, yeah, it's that. Let's move. Now, some horror can get around this problem. In media like The Thing, the horror hinges on trying to find out who the thing is currently impersonating, and the fear comes from the moment it's revealed. However, this isn't the case in Still Things The Bling. The monsters are rather animalistic in intelligence, which is fine, but that lack of identifiable silhouette really harms the initial fear factor. If I have to spend time to sit here and say, am I looking at the monster or just a plate of spilled pasta, then the initial fear is far lessened when I do end up identifying it. Now, the opposite can work, like an alien Isolation, where the game uses silhouettes that mimic the alien silhouette to get a quick scare out of us. But that only works because the xenomorph silhouette is so well defined. And again, this all happens in a literal fraction of a second, but it's still enough to lessen our overall fear. Compounding this problem is how it's usually very difficult to determine which way the monster is facing, either because it's simply too dark or because the monster looks like a giant floating tumor. Again, on paper, this sounds great. We don't know which way the monster is facing, so that's scarier, right? Unfortunately, again, this isn't how the human mind works. Animals in general, when in a prey situation, heavily associate eye contact with imminent threat. In other words, when you're trying to hide from a monster, you know you've been caught once it makes eye contact with you. This instinctively triggers a fear response, and it's why, when sneaking around, we try so hard to stay behind the threat. Even monsters without eyes, or eyes that are hard to see, we can use other methods to determine the front of an animal, such as by direction of motion or comparing it to other animals with similar body structures. However, the monsters in Still Wakes are either too messy or in too dark of an environment for us to be able to do that. Thus, sneaking around falls more into the realm of guesswork, more like, okay, I guess I'll go now, and not, okay, its back is turned, go, go, go. And neither do you get that tension of, oh crap, it's turning back my way, shit! To cap off this section, let's compare the monsters here to our first real encounter with the grunt from Amnesia. The game explicitly puts us in a scenario where we can get at least a quick glimpse of its silhouette. Even this brief moment is enough for our brains to identify and remember its shape, apply the response of danger to it via contextual discrimination, and assign it a front due to its humanoid body shape. With only a couple of exceptions, in Still Wakes, there's never really a good opportunity to get even a basic grasp of what the monster looks like. And rather than this making the monster scarier, it hinders our brain's ability to establish concrete threat and context, and thus, all fear becomes far less instinctual. I know the monsters are a threat, sure, but it's the same way that I know I'd die if I swallowed a nuclear bomb. It's a far more logical fear, and that definitely has its place when it's trying to be a far more cerebral, looming, psychological horror, but this game doesn't really capitalize on that. For a bit of a spoiler for the next part, this game basically has the same problem as the plot of Cowboys vs. Aliens. Wait, that's a terrible analogy. Nobody saw that movie. The issues the monsters place on the story is a bit layered, so this part is going to make like Sentinel Prime and get split in two. God, I wish I had seen that movie in theaters. The first half is going to talk about Kaz's character and how it just kinda stops, and the second half will cover how the monsters have so little going for them story-wise that you can consider them a kind of anti-Freddy Fazbear. Starting with Kaz the Pizzazz, I still think he's a fantastic character. His complicated home life, his relationship with his friends, his conflict with Rennick, his run from the law, I was really excited to see what became of all that. And then the Meatmen burst their way into the story like the goddamn Kool-Aid Man. Going back to the Cowboys vs. Aliens analogy that only people who watch Pointless Hub will get because, let's be honest, nobody saw this movie, Kaz's character development and in fact the plot in general just kind of stops once the monster shows up. Now, I wasn't expecting this game to end with Kaz standing triumphantly over the monsters and saying, "This encounter has taught me how to be a better husband, avoid going to jail, and beat my alcoholism all in one fell swoop." Rather, I was expecting this psychological horror game to develop the main theme of Kaz's character, and great horror games thrive on having their main character confronting the main theme that affects their character. Or really just one theme across like 70% of all horror games, considering it's the same one that James Sunderland, Isaac Clarke, Alan Wake, Mio Amakura, Sebastian Castellanos, Oswald Mandis, Daniel Amnesia, Simon Hendrickson, and yes, even Lorraine the Park all share. Guilt. In some way, shape, or form, these characters, including Lorraine kind of, end up confronting that guilt either by overcoming it or succumbing to it. Most of Isaac Clarke's time was spent engaging in really fun combat, but we still had time set aside for scenes of him confronting his dead wife, to which we eventually get some kind of conclusion. Most of Daniel's time is spent shitting his pants, but he eventually learns about his past sins, why his guilt set him on this path, and works to redeem himself. Shadow the Hedgehog is constantly haunted by his past trauma and guilt of not saving Maria, thus driving him to revenge, but he eventually realizes his folly and truly fulfills Maria's dying wish. Why does Kaz then, who started out so interesting and well-written, have less of a character arc than Shadow the damn Hedgehog? And this isn't hyperbole. Kaz's story never evolves. He never confronts his past demons, which is pretty sad considering we have literal shape-shifting demons to work with. Eldritch monsters using past trauma and guilt to further chip away at the victim's sanity is half the fun of the genre, and God, that makes me sound sadistic. There's really only one example I can think of where the game does this, when we get a phone call and Kaz hears this.
Shush! Shush! What's... Shush!
It's excellent. Keep doing this. But like everything else, it's too little too late. This and a few vague shouts from our wife and kid off in the distance are the only reality warping hallucinations we get. We see other characters have their perceptions warped, growing irrationally angry, falling into despair, all due to being in contact with the shape, so why not us? Sure, we get flashbacks, but unlike Shadow the Flashback Hog, whose flashbacks were the primary driving force of his actions, Kaz's flashbacks never mean anything to the greater story. Flashbacks show us visions of our kids, drown us in alcohol, give us a bunch of fake letters from our wife saying she is now completely in love with him again and supports his decision to run from the law, just to mess with Kaz and muddle his motivations. Oh wait, the game actually does do that after we're already dead. In short, why give Kaz this incredibly interesting and complex backstory and then not use it? He never gets a moment to even address his guilt in the end. Instead, all we get is him saying,
Sorry, Sus. Sorry.
and then that's it. But really, what else could the game have done? The whole let's blow up the rig plan happened in the last 2.5 minutes, and Kaz's themes of family and guilt hadn't showed up for the past several hours. Like I said, once the monsters show up, all story and character development just stops. I wouldn't be half as upset about this if the monsters had at least got some neat developments, but in truth they have less development than my cat Queso. I'm serious, my loud and violent baby boy has more of his backstory on YouTube than the shape gets in its entire game. Now at the start, it's all fantastic. As I said before, the shape can be both disgusting and gorgeous, and seeing our crewmates being steadily corrupted all around us is haunting to experience. Again, reminding you that I like this game and subscribe to it. These experiences make you ask so many questions. What is this stuff? Why and how does it take over people like this? Is it actually of this Earth or from some other planet, some other plane? Is it something intelligent or is it just some weird corruptive force? The game's answer?
I don't know, sir.
What the fuck do you mean I don't know?
Other than the very obvious facts of this stuff is dangerous and it turns people into monsters, nothing gets answered. Not where it came from, not how intelligent it is, not how it tastes, and come on, I am for some reason morbidly curious on that one. In fact, even its name, The Shape, was created by the community. It never comes up in game at all. And honestly, it's a fantastic name. Like whoever came up with that, great job. Now again, on paper, this sounds great. After all, what you don't know is scarier than what you do know, right? Yes, but to a point. In fact, just to further split this part into an unnecessary amount of fragments like the dungeons in Darksiders 2, there are 3 main reasons a horror monster should have some answers. Number 1, the right answers can actually spawn more questions, and far more interesting questions at that. Just look at the FNAF 1 animatronics. Once the game gives us enough hints to figure out that the animatronics are basically mechanical meat piñatas, we ask so many more questions.
Ring the lore, alarms the lore!
If the animatronics are being possessed by kids, why are they violent? Is it because they recognize us? Did we kill them? Is that why we keep coming back? And does them being possessed by kids make my attraction to Toy Chica seriously problematic?
She is such a bad bitch, though.
Number 2, answers can make the monsters scarier. Look at this little guy here from Soma. Sure, all his stomping and screaming makes him intimidating, but once we learn what these monsters actually are, oh boy, they're not just rampaging machines, they're perfect copies of an actual, once-living human mind forced and stuffed into a glitching robot, one that their human perception struggles to adapt to, lacking so many of the senses we take for granted. Even hearing and seeing is so much different that it drives that once human mind into a distorted feral beast. Number 3, the right answer can better sew both the monster and the player into the world of the game. Pointing to a different fleshy ethereal substance that I am far less interested in tasting for some reason, we learn that the red goopy stuff from Amnesia is called the Shadow, and is the will of some incorporeal, unstoppable force that has breached into our dimension for the sole purpose of hunting down and killing you specifically. And there's also a kind of pseudo 4th reason. Humans just like answers. Questions inherently are a thing human minds try to resolve, and mysteries especially are kinda like super questions specifically crafted to make our monkey brains go DK bonanzas. Yes, I know I've already made that joke in this video, I just really want to play that game. It's actually a little disturbing how much a good mystery hacks our brain. If you need proof of that, just look at the success of FNAF and how many millions of views their lore videos get. But a mystery being satisfying relies on a satisfying answer, and that's why the shape is so frustrating. We learn literally nothing about this stuff. And sure, we don't need to learn this thing's entire life cycle, even though we did with the xenomorph and that's still plenty scary, but just some kind of answer to give us a vague clue as to what we're up against would be great. How is it able to mutate humans like that? Why is it transforming us? What does it taste like? Damn it! The characters never even bother trying to figure out ways to fight back against the stuff. They just kind of accept it like it's just another occupational hazard. And remember when I said most of the plot was just some character tells you to go fix something but warns you there's a monster turned away? That wasn't me being my typical adorable hyperbolic self. Pretty much every single goal you get in the game outside of the last 5 minutes is about doing something related to keeping the oil rig afloat. And yeah, that's pretty important. Morgan Yu from Prey had plenty of tasks like that, but we were also building up a way to eliminate the Typhon threat throughout the majority of the story. And that's the problem. Still floats the boat, only builds up that confrontation for the last 2.5 minutes, and because of that, it makes the monsters feel more like obstacles than the big overarching threat. Instead, the game's focus is far more fixated on the Byra D than it is the shape. I died way more times to the rig falling apart than any of the monsters, which brings me around to one rather interesting conclusion. After Rennick dies, thank God, the main antagonist isn't the shape, it's the Byra D. So to bring things back around to the original point of this video, saying that the monsters were poorly implemented only covered half the issue. I still need to explain why the game would be better without them. For one, we already have an antagonist, and a pretty damn good one, Rennick. I can honestly say I haven't hated a character in a game this hard since Wally Franks. God, I hope I get to kill that annoying waste of time in Dark Revival. The difference is that Rennick is meant to be hated, and the game does a great job of it. He insults us to our face, refuses to talk to us, runs the crew into the ground. Literally everyone on the Byra D hates him, and he knows it. Hell, he's even the reason we encounter the shape in the first place. In essence, every death is on his hands. Even his very last action is leaving the entire crew for dead, which makes his own demise so sweet that I want to take his death and bake it into a cake with the words on top saying, "Rennick is dead, ha ha." So I want you to think about all that and then take the monsters out of it. Suddenly, every single death has an entirely different tone to it. People aren't dying because a bunch of monsters are showing up. We're dying because one fuckhead wanted to meet quota, and that's even more disturbing in a certain way. And the Byra D itself is still plenty terrifying without the monsters. There are some extremely intimidating moments where Kaz has to undertake some very not OSHA approved actions to keep the Byra D afloat. Without the monsters, we can amplify these. Really focus on how the Byra D is falling apart. Hell, on the way, we can learn just how badly the rig was being maintained in the first place. Just how incompetent and reckless Rennick was even before Kaz got here. Without the monsters, we can also amplify the character drama. In game, we're constantly being isolated so we can have spooky encounters with the monsters. Without them, we can have a lot more character interactions. People throwing around blame, tempers flaring, even more arguing with the bastard, and just getting to know the other characters like this, either improving or worsening our relationships. This adds so much more impact when they die to another Rennick-caused accident. But most importantly, there's one other quality Rennick has that makes his death halfway through the game kind of a waste. Rennick is a perfect focal point for Kaz's character development. He's constantly threatening to send Kaz back to land to be arrested by the police, which Kaz sees as the greatest threat to losing his wife and children. Having Rennick around can make Kaz constantly question the value of his actions. Why is he trying so hard, risking his life to keep the rig afloat if he's just going to lose everything he cares about? Or maybe he sees this as a means of redemption, some vague hope that Rennick won't fire him if he proves himself. Or maybe he gains a martyr complex and thinks, if I can't save my family on land, at least I can save this family. Just do something with his character, anything. Additionally, Rennick was crafted by Michelangelo himself to be the perfect asswipe, someone to really test Kaz's patience and violent nature. Why not have that as the final conflict? Have the animosity between the two really come to a head. Rennick's irresponsible management, the deaths on his hands, it all becomes too much, and Kaz honestly considers killing the bastard when it seems like he'll have some way to weasel his way out of consequences. And that's the choice. Kaz can give into his anger and kill Rennick, which the guy definitely deserves, only to realize he's now doomed himself and lost everything. Or he realizes he needs to overcome that nature and let Rennick go. As unjust as it is, he owes it to his wife and children. And that's just some idea off the top of my head. There are so many ways they could have taken Kaz's character. Now compare everything I said with Rennick to the shape. It doesn't really do anything to amplify the drama that would have already been happening in a rapidly crumbling oil rig. Even the characters seem far more concerned with the Byra D than the monsters. Like I said before, even with how the game is now, the main threat in the game is the rig itself, and the monsters only kind of serve as a distraction. From the Byra D, the characters, everything really. And that's why they acted as such a detriment to me. I didn't find their encounters all that scary, they never evolved in any way to keep the mystery going, and they never did anything to further Kaz's journey. Having Rennick in that place instead, and having the focus on the characters just trying to survive this collapsing oil rig, would have given the game so many opportunities to evolve Kaz's character, evolve the threat, evolve the story. But once the monsters show up, all of this just stops, and this goes from a game I love to a game I only like. And that's honestly why I made this video. The opening is so strong that it really helps to carry the rest of the game. Even after the midway point, the character acting is phenomenal, and I was really taken aback at several of the character deaths. On top of that, the environment itself becomes this beautiful, aggressively violent beast that is both your lifeline and actively trying to kill you. Yes, I have a type, shut up! My problems with the monsters are significant, and they do bring this game down for me. But this is easily my third favorite game I've played on this channel. My criticism here isn't coming from a place of malice, it's from a place of loving disappointment. Like I've been saying throughout the video, I actually do like this game. I can see myself playing it again, in fact. And honestly, that was a surprise for me. To be frank, while I do my best to go into games unbiased, there was the small issue of the game's developer hiding away in the back of my mind like a tiny little goblin chipping away at my golden mind nuggets. The Chinese Room, at least in my opinion, doesn't have the best track record with horror. Their prior title of note is Machine for Pigs, and while I love the setting, like I shouldn't even have to state that part, come on, compared to its predecessor, Dark Descent, the actual game was, not great. Also, they pulled the whole bet you can't guess what happened to your spooky ghost kids. So Still Wakes the Deep was actually a pleasant surprise. I can see that the developers are really improving their craft, or at least maybe they are, since the Still Wakes DLC is, I'll have to get back to you on that one. But at the very least, Still Wakes is a good game. Not to mention, it's an amazing improvement over the other Chinese Room game I played literally just before this one. And you'd know what that game is, at least if any of you had bothered to solve the small little ARG I hid in one of my Bendy videos. That's right, it's a game I've been planning all the way back since Bendy. And am I excited with what I have to show you. What am I planning? What is this game? You gotta figure that out for yourself, buddy. But it's coming up soon-ish.
Oh, never mind, guess that joke doesn't work now because Skong is coming.
And it's gonna be a doozy. I am definitely not overblowing this next video.